Again, so today we're going over a lesson on the Northwest Ordinance. So this is something that went right, something that was well done, well thought out, and somehow passed, and really worked well during the Articles of Confederation and under those rules. So to remind you, when they were set up, it's this loose conglomeration, this loose alliance of states, and they're really only unified in huge things like let's make a war, and they're not very well set up to settle land disputes. They're not allowed to raise taxes. So those weaknesses are kind of glaring. But one thing that happened after the war was over, they could finally have access to all of that land from the French and Indian War, the Ohio River Valley. All of that land is now available. It's been taken away from the Quebec colony, and now it's part of America, and we have to decide what to do with it. So that's what today's lesson is really all about. Okay, so the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 finishes a process that really began in 1785 of deciding how to deal with this land, and these are kind of those states that become from the Ohio River Valley. And we'll test myself here. This ought to be good. You got some Michigan here and here, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. There you go. I did it. I'm proud of me. Okay, the Northwest Ordinance is dealing with the age-old problem of the Ohio River Valley. So we've got a confederation, loosely joined states. They're not completely autonomous, but they're not completely controlled by any central government either. Many different states claimed that this land should be theirs. All right, so I don't know if I can make this bigger or not. But this is what, after the war, England said, hey, this stuff's all yours now. We hate you, you're jerks, here's what you get. Now, if you look at this, the area in green is what we're talking about. But Virginia believes it has rights to everything all the way to here, all the way to the Mississippi River. Pennsylvania believes it has some rights. New York believes it has rights to some things. Somehow, like little tiny Connecticut here thinks it has a play in some of this. And when you get to these southern states, they again believe they have rights to some of this land over here. So there's many people that believe they should have this land. And there's really a big land boom where people are investing and trying to get rich based off this land, including some of the big players in American history that are trying to make some money up in there. All right, let me shrink that back down. Maybe move it back into our little video here. Okay, sorry about that. All right, so that's the area that we're fighting over. And the states agreed that they're going to give their claims away. So instead of fighting, hey, Virginia gets it, no, Connecticut gets it, hey, they're going to say, we're going to give all the land to the country as a whole. And you're going to do things with that land that are in the best interest of all of us. And you'll see that they have some pretty good ideas that actually help make them some money. So this is called national domain. It's going to be public land that belongs to the nation, to the Confederation. In the Northwest Ordinance from 1785, Congress had made these plans how to sell this land. And this is a great idea because they're in debt from the Revolutionary War. If you remember, the whole reason that England started all those taxes that led to the Revolutionary War was because they were in debt from the French and Indian War. Well, shockingly, after we fight this big, long Revolutionary War, now America's in a ton of debt. And we would like to raise taxes to recoup from that, because shockingly, that's the best answer. Go figure. England had it right. But we can't just raise taxes because the national government's not allowed to. So what they decide to do is sell off this land, because people have been wanting to move into that area for years and years and years, since before the French and Indian War. And now the nation can sell that and use the money to pay off some of that debt. They survey the land and they divide it up into all these little squares, okay? Now the problem with dividing up land into squares like this is not all land is created equal, right? If you're a farmer, you want to be somewhere where it's relatively flat, where it's not completely overrun with, forests, and you want some water. If you don't have a river or creek or something running through there, you're going to be at the mercy of the rain or your neighbor to water your crops. So even though this looks really cool on paper, each one of these squares is not really equal. They divide up things into townships. Now, a township is going to be 36 square miles. That's a big chunk. That's a township. We might as well just call it a town. Each town's 36 miles, 6 miles by 6 miles. Okay, that's a big chunk of town, especially back then. Here's some pictures of how that might look when it's broken down a little more, superimposed on what the actual land with its features looks like. Okay, within that 36 square miles, you have 36 individual miles that are 1 mile square. Okay, and each one of those is a whole bunch of acres. Here comes some math. Okay, the smallest portion you can sell is 1 acre. The average family farm's 40 acres. That's kind of what you need to make enough money to make it work. That would sell for $40. Now, a super cool thing is you sell those chunks of land, one section from each township. The money that's raised from selling that goes for a school. So they're going to build a school for that township. It doesn't mean that the township school occupies 1 square. It just means that the money from selling one of those squares is going to go to a township. And another thing, I don't remember if they talk about it in here, but they also owe soldiers from the Revolutionary War a lot of money because these guys didn't get paid even though they're out there fighting and making the country happen. And so they're going to sell, I think it was 2 or 3 of those sections, and the money, instead of paying off the debt directly, is going to go to pay the Revolutionary War soldiers the money that's owed to them. So another good thing, because you're not only getting out of debt that you owe other countries, but you owe a pretty big debt to these people who've gone on and lived and died. All right. So here we go. The additions that they make in 1787 are what's it going to take to add a new state to the Union. So when the population reaches 5,000 adult males, that means they can elect their own legislator. They're not a state yet, but they can elect their own people. They can send non-voting members to Congress, so they get a voice. It doesn't count when they vote, but they get to hear what's going on, and they get to maybe make suggestions and that kind of thing. When the population reaches 60,000 adult males, now you can write an actual state constitution and then apply to the national government, to the Confederation, to become a new state. If Congress approves of the Constitution, then that area becomes a new state. And under those rules, then there would be, 14 or 15 or 16 people voting within the Congress. So these are the states that get added: Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, and Wisconsin. And if you look at the years they become states, this is the one that's closest to the existing colonies. And this, you move further west and further north, but mostly west, it takes longer and longer for people to fill in there to have enough adult males to actually apply and achieve statehood. Okay, some other rights that are guaranteed in all these areas. So these areas are under federal control. They're under the control of the Articles of Confederation government until they become a state. So if you live in that area, you're guaranteed a trial by jury. You're guaranteed a public education, which is important. That's why they're building the schools out there. If you remember from your brochure projects, in a lot of areas you just learned how to read and write at home from the Bible. Not everywhere had public schooling, but now they're going to have public schools everywhere in these new states, and that's going to be a precedent moving forward. You get freedom of religion. So even though Maryland was mostly Catholic, and there's a lot of Quakers in Pennsylvania, a lot of Puritans who drove everybody nuts in Massachusetts, if you're in any of those Northwest Ordinance areas that became states later on, you can practice any religion. That was also important because, there was a lot of the people from Quebec, the Canadians up there, that were formerly French Catholics, And if they still live in those areas, they're going to be allowed to practice Catholicism, which is important because that was not well thought of in most of the colonies. And slavery is not going to be allowed in any of those areas. Okay, so that's important for two reasons. One, practically speaking, there's not a big reason to need slaves that far north. It's really cold. You don't have the kind of farming you do down in the south. If you go to some of those states today, you see nothing but farms. Okay, but they're growing corn and soybeans. They're growing things that are different than would have been grown in the south. Okay, so tobacco, cotton, those crops don't really grow up there. So you don't have the labor shortages, so you don't have a need for slavery. Okay, but the other part of that is if these come in and become states later on, that's going to tilt the balance of power, because right now you have about the same number of slave states as you do free states. And that's really going to start to shift and be a huge problem that doesn't really get resolved until the Civil War. All right, so that's it for the Northwest Ordinance. Let's review some of the big points. You're going to sell that land to pay off some national debt. That's important. You're also going to sell part of that land to pay for schools, and you're going to sell part of that land to pay the Revolutionary War soldiers. So you're getting a lot of goodwill. You found a way to make some money without raising taxes. That's good. And you set some ground rules for how people can become a state, getting a certain number of adult males, and you're going to be able to slowly, when you have enough, apply for state after you have your own state constitution. Last two things to think about. The one is slavery. It's outlawed up in these areas, but that's going to become a more and more pressing issue as the balance of power becomes more and more out of balance. There'll be big fights over who's going to be slavery and who's not. And the other thing to think about is all of these areas we're talking about, they had people living in them. All right? You had the French Catholics. You had settlers already there from the colonies, but you had large Native American populations. They weren't really given a great say here. We did send people and we made treaties with them. We weren't strong enough to just impose our will and throw them out. Unfortunately, that's where we're headed. So I guess in some ways they've had maybe more rights because we had to make deals with them. Our country wasn't strong enough to just rule with an iron fist. But generally speaking, we're still taking land from the natives who continue to lose with every interaction with the white man, whether that's Americans, French, the British. It's just rough to be Native American. All right, that's it for this one, and I will talk to you when we get to Shays' Rebellion.